Just imagine this. You're not just any traveler. You're a hardened Crusader knight, fresh from the blood and grit of months-long siege warfare. Your sword arm is sore, your armor is finally stashed away, and the weight of a heavy purse, brimming with plunder, hangs temptingly at your side. It's the year 1187, and you push open the creaking door of a dim, smoky tavern in Jerusalem. The air hits you like a wall, thick with the stench of sour wine, unwashed bodies, and something far more dangerous than any Saracen blade: violence. If you were in that knight's boots, would you sit quietly and keep your gold close, or dive headfirst into the chaos of that tavern? Tell me your choice in the comments. I want to know how you'd survive the night. Think you've seen a wild night out? Think your weekend bar hops are intense? Forget it. What you're about to walk into makes your modern nightlife look like a quiet dinner party. The Crusader Tavern was not a casual drinking hole. It was a powder keg, a volatile mix of armed veterans, desperate gamblers, displaced nobles, and sin simmering at a rolling boil. Here, steel and temper were just one bad hand of dice away from exploding into chaos. These weren't polite alehouses where warriors sat around quoting scripture and nursing mugs of mead. No, these were lawless dens where men who'd sworn sacred vows shed their holiness like a second skin. A single dice throw could cost you your coin, your pride, or your life. And if you think that's dramatic, consider this. These places were so notorious that the church itself forbade members of the great military orders, the Templars, the Hospitallers, from even stepping through the door. They knew the risk. Why? Because these weren't just drinking spots. They were recruitment centers for every vice imaginable. Gambling, prostitution, secret deals, theft, murder, all thrived under the same flickering torchlight. God's warriors, fresh from holy war, were transformed into something far more unpredictable than any enemy on the battlefield. Remember, the crusade was supposed to be the ultimate act of devotion, an armed pilgrimage, a sacred war fought for salvation. But once those same knights crossed the tavern threshold, those ideals burned away like parchment in a hearth. Preachers could thunder, commanders could threaten, but keeping crusaders out of the bars? Impossible. And every time they went in, there were consequences, sometimes bloody ones. Now, to really understand the danger, you need to know this: medieval taverns weren't uniform. They were layered worlds of risk. At the bottom were the alehouses, low, cramped, filthy rooms thick with the smell of stale drink and sweat, packed with common foot soldiers who lived for cheap cider and mead. These places were ready to erupt at any moment, full of men trained since childhood to settle problems not with words, but with steel. But the real danger? That belonged to the upscale taverns. Picture rooms lit with candlelight, tables crowded with goblets of strong, sweet wine, and an audience of knights, mercenary captains, and wandering nobles, men with coin to spend and blood to spill. Here, entertainment came in many forms. Gambling tables clattered, dice rolled, music played, and shadowed corners offered services that would make a modern red light district look like a family outing. And here's the twist. People didn't just drink for fun. They drank because it was safer than water. Contaminated wells could kill you. A goblet of wine kept you alive. But this meant entire armies were functionally drunk. Day after day, men armored and armed, blades at their hips, trained since childhood to kill efficiently. So when a fight broke out, it didn't end with fists and broken bottles. It ended with steel drawn, knives flashing, and blood on the floor. Archaeologists and medieval coroners' records paint a grim picture. Fatal stabbings, slashed throats, crushed skulls, all sparked by something as trivial as a crooked game of dice or a drunken insult. Take the infamous brawl at Saint Innocent in Paris, 1288. What began as a spat, a disgruntled customer arguing with a pimp, ignited into a full-scale riot. By the time it was over, the entire tavern had turned into a battlefield. Tables shattered, chairs splintered, men cut down where they stood. This was not entertainment. This was war carried into the night. They weren't fighting because of loyalty, politics, or revenge. They were fighting simply because violence was thrilling. To many of these men, chaos was entertainment, bloodshed was a sport. This was recreational warfare, a disturbing reminder of just how deeply normalized brutality had become in these environments. And remember, this started with bare fists and boots. But when tempers boiled over and steel came out, the entire mood shifted. Suddenly, a drunken argument could turn into a public execution, and the body count would climb fast. Chroniclers of the time didn't sensationalize these moments. They documented them like surgeons describing a wound, cold, precise, and disturbingly routine. When you mix constant weapon access with men trained since boyhood to kill, the smallest spark, an insult, a lost bet, even a spilled drink, could ignite deadly violence. Now, if you think this was bad in Europe, wait until you hear about the Latin East. The Crusader states were an entirely different beast, wilder, deadlier, and completely unrestrained. Back in England or France, authorities at least tried to limit the carrying of blades in public. But in the Holy Land? Forget it. Nobody even bothered with such rules. This was the frontier, a world where survival meant being armed at all times. Picture a medieval city in the Crusader states. Streets crammed with mercenaries, hardened knights, restless squires, and peasants who carried swords the way you carry your phone. Communities formed militias not for ceremony but because invasion or rebellion could happen any day. Everyone was armed, everyone was trained, and everyone was ready to use deadly force at a moment's notice. This is why a single argument in a tavern could erupt into a massacre before anyone had time to blink. And here's the kicker: violence was only one part of the chaos. These same taverns were also the beating heart of another obsession: gambling. But don't imagine friendly card games or casual bets. No, medieval gambling was raw, consuming, and dangerously addictive. It pulled in everyone: monks and mercenaries, nobles and commoners, even Christians and Muslims rolling dice side by side. For people living in a world of constant danger and short lifespans, gambling wasn't just entertainment. It was pure adrenaline, a way to feel alive. The games were deliberately simple, designed to hook players instantly. Dice games like Hazard required no strategy, no intelligence, just luck. And that was the draw. Anyone could play, anyone could win, and just as easily, anyone could lose everything they owned with one bad throw. Imagine knights betting not just coins but swords, horses, even their armor. What's even more startling? Archaeology backs it all up. Dice, gaming boards, counters, they've been uncovered across the Crusader states. And shockingly, many were found in religious houses and castles belonging to the very men sworn to poverty and purity, the Templars and Hospitallers. These were warrior monks, men who vowed chastity and humility, yet they spent their nights huddled over dice, gambling away their vows. The church hated it. Priests warned it was a moral cancer, a distraction from holy duty. And they weren't wrong. Some knights were so consumed by gambling that they abandoned their posts, squandered their money, and even bet away their weapons, the very tools they needed to fight. And sometimes the stakes were far higher than money. Take one of the most shocking episodes in Crusader history: the assassination of Hugh, Lord of Jaffa. In 1134, Hugh was found guilty of rebelling against King Fulk of Anjou and sentenced to 3 years of exile. That should have been the end of his story. But instead of leaving, Hugh lingered in Jerusalem, drawn to the capital's taverns and gambling dens like a moth to flame. Now picture it: a bright afternoon on the bustling street of the furriers, merchants calling out, people haggling, and right there in the open, a dice table set up outside a shop. Hugh sits at the table, flushed from drink, fully absorbed in his game. The crowd watches, the clatter of dice echoing on the stones. Then it happens. A Breton knight steps forward. No shouting, no warning. He draws his sword, and before anyone can react, he drives the blade into Hugh. Again and again. The street freezes. Dice scatter. A nobleman dies not in battle, not in exile, but sprawled over a gaming table, murdered in full view of the city. The assassination was so shockingly open, so brazen, that chroniclers couldn't help but emphasize one detail. It happened right there in front of everyone. This wasn't a shadowy back-alley murder or some secretive political hit arranged under cover of darkness. No, this was a killing done in the most public way imaginable, broad daylight, in the middle of a bustling street, while the victim was casually throwing dice. Pause and really think about what that says about Crusader society. A high-ranking noble, even one disgraced and sentenced to exile, still felt comfortable enough to sit at a gambling table in the open, surrounded by townsfolk. Gambling wasn't a guilty pleasure. It was so normalized that even political exiles couldn't stay away. But more striking than the gambling was the violence. It was so woven into the fabric of life that a public assassination barely raised eyebrows. Crowds witnessed it, yet nobody seemed particularly shocked. That was just life in the Crusader states. And gambling? It wasn't just a harmless pastime, it was a dangerous obsession. Medieval chroniclers write about it with an almost alarmed tone, warning how this addiction chipped away at military focus. Knights, sworn defenders of Christendom, would lose hours, even entire nights, throwing dice, neglecting their duties. Equipment funds were squandered on wagers, and there are accounts of men literally gambling away their weapons, their horses, even their armor. Imagine that, trained warriors stripping themselves of the very tools that kept them alive, just for the thrill of chance. The church tried to intervene. Authorities called gambling a gateway vice, a sin that opened the door to worse sins. They issued warnings, sermons, even punishments, but it was like shouting into the wind. The games were too addictive. They required no skill, no study, no experience. Anyone could play, anyone could win, and more dangerously, anyone could lose everything with a single roll. Now picture the psychology of these men. Crusaders were no strangers to death. They stormed castles, endured sieges, survived battlefields soaked in blood. Yet what they couldn't resist was the rush of a game of chance. The unknown outcome of a dice throw gripped them harder than fear of the sword. But gambling was only one layer of the chaos. It was just the surface of a far deeper moral unraveling. Because these same taverns that echoed with the sound of dice and coins also hosted another thriving business: prostitution. And not discreet, hidden brothels. No, the Crusader states saw prostitution practiced almost in the open. In fact, in many so-called Holy Lands, the tavern and the brothel were often the same place. Even travelers who were not part of the Crusades couldn't help but notice. Usama ibn Munkid, a Syrian noble and diplomat, wrote colorful accounts of Frankish prostitutes he heard about, though he politely claimed these were stories told to him by friends. The truth was unavoidable. Prostitution was not only common, it was normalized, so much so that foreign dignitaries wrote about it in their memoirs. This mix, alcohol, gambling, sex, and a population of armed, restless warriors, was volatile. Disputes were frequent. Arguments over payments, jealousy, or drunken insults could spiral into bloodshed in an instant. And when the men fighting were trained killers carrying swords, the outcomes were often catastrophic. Even Constantinople, the great Byzantine capital and a major stopping point for Crusaders, saw entire districts set aside for brothels. Foreign visitors recorded their shock at the blatant openness. Women working in the streets, trade happening in broad daylight. And yet, the same Crusaders who preached piety were often the first to indulge. Chronicles note their hypocrisy, condemning vice with one breath, indulging in it with the next. The Crusader states weren't just battlefields, they were reputations, and not always noble ones. By the late 13th century, their behavior was so infamous it shaped politics. In 1268, when Sultan Baybars was asked to negotiate with the Lord of Jaffa, he didn't just say no, he refused outright. Why? Because the Franks had pushed things so far they turned Jaffa's taverns into brothels, even placing Muslim women inside. To Baybars, that was no insult to brush off. It was a stain so deep it ended diplomacy on the spot. And these weren't just whispers or enemy propaganda. Jewish communities in Egypt spoke of the same taverns, describing places thick with alcohol, gambling, and vice, where respect for faith and order dissolved completely. These stories crossed borders, told by Christians, Muslims, and Jews alike, a rare agreement among faiths about just how far things had gone. So the next time you think your local bar gets wild, or you read about nightlife turning violent, remember this: the taverns of medieval Crusader cities weren't just pubs. They were pressure cookers of violence and indulgence. Arenas where lords were stabbed mid-game, fortunes were gambled away, and holy warriors forgot their vows in a haze of drink and desire. Your craziest night out? It wouldn't even count as a quiet Tuesday in the backstreets of Jerusalem. Now I want to hear from you. Which part of this shocked you the most? The politics, the scandals, or the sheer chaos of it all? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Before you go, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Vassal Truths. We uncover the untold and unexpected sides of history that textbooks leave out. Stay curious, our next story might change how you see the past forever.